From the world of politics.
I have said since January 6th that I will do whatever it takes to ensure Donald Trump is never again anywhere near the Oval Office, and I mean it.
To the world of business.
There's no doubt that we're in a transition. It's a transition that our economy needs to get to that more stable growth. But if you look at the strength of our labor market, the ongoing resilience of household balance sheets and industrial production, certainly we believe that it's possible for us to make this transition in a way where we don't have to give up all of those economic gains.
This is Balance of Power with David Westin.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our television and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Well, as we wait for those Federal Reserve minutes due out in about 2 hours from right now, we got some other economic numbers this morning, retail sales numbers for the United States. And to take us through what they told us about the economy, we welcome back now Bloomberg International Economics and Policy Correspondent Mike McKee. So, Mike, tell me about those retail sales numbers. It looked like a bit of a mixed bag.
That's exactly right, David. It is a mixed bag. It's a little bit of the oil man giveth and the oil man taketh away. And also a little bit of inflation, or shall we say a lot of inflation. The headline number was flat for the month, did not change. But if you subtract gasoline from that, and of course gasoline prices went down, it was a 0.2% gain. The core rate, which takes out gasoline, building materials, and automobiles, rose a strong 0.8%. And that got Wall Street all excited. But here's the problem with that. These numbers are not adjusted for inflation and also not adjusted for population. And the population's always growing, which means more people spending money. And if you make those adjustments and you compare that to the nominal numbers that we got today, what we're seeing is very flat consumer spending for the last 18 months or so. Sort of after the stimulus money started to run out, people are spending more than they were before the pandemic, but they're not spending an increasing amount.
Mike, these numbers are coming out, CPI numbers, retail sales numbers, so many numbers. Do they underscore the fact that whatever minutes we get from the Federal Reserve may be a little out of date? Because there's a lot more numbers that are come before September.
Yes, we've seen a lot of conflicting numbers, and the Fed didn't have any of those when it met on June 27th. So I wouldn't expect anything really dispositive out of the minutes. However, Jay Powell sounded a little bit dovish when he was addressing the media after the meeting. And so maybe we'll see if there's a more hawkish note inside. You can see there where the, and I apologize for people on radio, but the overall Fed figures for where they think rates are going to go are much higher than where the market thinks rates are going to go. And maybe Jay Powell next week tries to get them back on the same page.
Exactly. Setting up your appearance in Jackson Hole next week. We'll be looking forward to that. Thank you so much to Bloomberg's Michael McKee. Well, in the meantime, President Biden yesterday signed that Inflation Reduction Act, something he believes will have a material effect on the U.S. economy. And this is part of what he had to say as he signed it.
Every single Republican in Congress voted against this bill. Every single Republican in Congress voted against lowering prescription drug prices, against lowering health care costs, against the fair tax system. Every single Republican, every single one, voted against tackling the climate crisis, against lowering our energy costs, against creating good-paying jobs.
We turn now to somebody who decided he did not vote against it. That's Democratic Representative Hailey Stevens of Michigan. So, Congresswoman, thank you so much. Love having you on. I know you supported this. Give us a sense of what you think that this may do, the Inflation Reduction Act. We'll come back to the CHIPS Act, what it will do for the U.S. economy, and particularly for your constituents in Michigan.
Well, look, this is a great legislative day. It's a triumphant day. We got an incredible package, not only passed, but signed into law by the president, and it's the largest investment ever in our climate and our climate future. That's going to have catalytic results for Michigan, particularly for our electric vehicle sector and what's taking place in automotive, line up those Buy America provisions, but also just lowering costs. And so when you hear the president talk about why folks didn't vote for this bill and what took place there, $300 billion for the deficit reduction, and yet the party of supposed fiscal responsibility didn't vote for it. And we're not only doing that, we are also making sure that Americans have access to affordable prescription drugs. We're freeing up what's in their pocketbook. Just yesterday, I was in Pontiac, Michigan at the Bowen Center with almost 100 seniors talking to them about the impacts and the meaning of this bill. And David, I wish you could have heard the applause, because people were so appreciative and so fired up, not only about the prescription drugs, but also what we're doing with Medicare Part D and capping it at 2,000.
I'm sure that's right, Congresswoman. At the same time, as long as it took to get this done, there's a question of when are those seniors in Pontiac, Michigan going to see the benefits? Because aren't a lot of those benefits, particularly with prescription drugs, they're not going to kick in for some years, are they?
Yeah, that's true. We have a time-bound constriction on that, but yet it's certainty, and that's what's most important. And it's going to force our drug manufacturers to change. It's going to give seniors something to look forward to, and it's happened rather than not having a law at all. The future, and particularly for those who are, families who are looking at forever costs of prescription drugs, the insulin costs, that's so real. And that gives people long-term future planning and certainty. And look, I have worked in the Obama administration. I've worked in federal policy, now as a member of Congress. And I'll tell you, it's not wave a wand, but it's get a bill done. And that's what you're seeing here, that those in the Congress, particularly the Democrats who want to make sure that we have good governance, that's what's getting done. I call this President Biden's South Carolina moment, right? Because you got a gun safety bill done, a chips and science bill done, and now this Inflation Reduction Act, all in this quarter. It's absolutely fantastic.
Well, as you say, it's not just the Inflation Reduction, it's also the Chips and Science Act, which I know you really worked very, very hard on. You and I have talked about it more than once, how important that was for the country, but also specifically for Michigan. That was not entirely partisan. There was some bipartisan support for that one. Give us a sense of what that will mean. And most important, same question as on the Inflation Reduction Act, when?
Yeah, we got an amazing competitive framework put into place with the Chips and Science Act. First, with the $52 billion for chip manufacturing production, you asked when. Our governor, Gretchen Whitmer, has been lining up and recruiting companies to come in. I'm told that we've got some real promising things on the horizon for chip manufacturing production here in Michigan, all as a result of this legislation, which is really exciting. I've seen my governor putting in that tire tread time and working to recruit those manufacturers to Michigan, working alongside our auto industry, but also that long-term incentive, which is coming into place. So that, again, gives us that framework for years and years to come to be able to compete with our foreign competitors in a way that we should have been competing for a long time. The other components with the doubling of the scientific research budget, the NIST for the Future Act, which I helped to author, the Chipping In Act, which I authored, again, on workforce and technical assistance, and I'm building a framework for our future that makes sure that we continue to lead the innovation horizon here in the United States of America. Let them eat our lunch, because we are innovating. That's the plight of the 21st century here in the United States of America, with the proliferation of the gig economy, our advanced manufacturing sector, and what we're doing with the new generation of electric vehicle technology, zero emissions technology that's seeding through our auto industry right now. I want to make, produce, and sell right here in the place that I call home. That's Oakland County, Michigan.
Congresswoman, that's very hopeful and very promising. At the same time, we're talking about something like $52 billion to get spent. And at the same time, we wanted to do it fairly fast. What is the implementation process for this? And how do we get it out the door as fast as we need to get out the door, and at the same time, not run the risk of actually waste and even fraud? Because we have had instances in the past when the federal government started giving money to industries, it didn't get spent very well.
Well, those guardrails, David, are so important, and our president prioritized them, and certainly under the leadership of Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo. Do not underestimate Gina Raimondo, who is running an incredible Department of Commerce. And particularly, I had the privilege, because of my oversight role as vice chair of the House Science Committee, to sit down with our government leaders at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, an institute that touches all of our lives, but maybe might not be at the forefront of your mind. They have that implementation plan down. Obviously, not something that we're going to see in a 24-hour span, but as it plays out over a multitude of quarters. We also know with chips that those are forever changing. We're looking at the legacy chip, the high technology chips. I've been working very closely with the Motor Equipment Manufacturers Association, MEMA, and they've put a big emphasis too on the types of chips that our auto suppliers need. And that's the bill that we got to make sure that we have what we need for right now and what we can't even imagine, but we know is coming down the pipeline. So for all of you watching, pay attention to what's going on at NIST, because they've got a plan to roll out those dollars and make sure that they get into the hands of the good stewards, the proper actors. We're talking about good American jobs. The CHIPS Act is an investment in the American worker. I was with the UAW days before final passage. It was a major, major moment for us here in Southeastern Michigan.
Congresswoman, thank you so very much. And congratulations, and I know you fought really hard for it. That's Michigan Representative Hailey Stevens. Coming up is the housing market in a recession. We asked Tom Shapiro of GTIS Partners. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. To keep you up to date with news from all around the world, we welcome now Mark Crumpton here with the first word. Mark.
David, thank you. Big changes are in store at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Dr. Rochelle Walensky is announcing an overhaul of the agency aimed at revamping everything from its operations to its culture. In a statement, Dr. Walensky said during the COVID pandemic, quote, "In our big moment, our performance did not reliably meet expectations," end quote. Rudy Giuliani is facing a special grand jury in Georgia today. The panel's investigating attempts by former President Donald Trump and others to overturn his 2020 election defeat. As he entered the courthouse in Atlanta, Giuliani told reporters that he wouldn't talk about his testimony, saying, quote, "Grand juries, as I recall, are secret," end quote. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky is warning civilians to stay away from military facilities occupied by Russian forces. That followed explosions at a Russian ammunition dump in Crimea. A Zelensky advisor said the blasts marked the beginning of a series of attacks. Last week, explosions at a Russian airbase in Crimea destroyed fighter jets. A United Nations slavery expert has found claims of forced labor in Xinjiang to be, quote, reasonable. A report out today is one of the clearest critiques of China's human rights practices from within the world body. China has denied forced labor accusations, calling them, quote, the lie of the century. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Mark. Well, as we, along with the Federal Reserve, try to get our arms around the economy, exactly where it is, where it's going, one of the things that's flashing at least yellow on the dashboard is the housing market. There have been a lot of weak numbers coming out in the housing market. And to take us through what's going on in housing, and for that matter, real estate more broadly, we turn now to Tom Shapiro. He's President and Chief Investment Officer of GTIS Partners. Tom, great to have you back with us. You know this area so terribly well. What's gone wrong, if indeed something's gone wrong? It seems like we were on a tear. Everything was going really, really well, and now it seems to have hit a neutral at least.
Great. David, thank you so much for having me. I actually don't think there's anything quite wrong at this point. We were obviously putting up incredibly high housing numbers. July starts now are starting to peel down, 1.45 million, down about 9.6%. As I mentioned when I met with you in May, we talked about this. It's not a supply issue. We have very, very few housing units available. It's really now getting into this demand shock that I warned was going to happen in May. So we're seeing things slow down empirically through our portfolio. I looked at the numbers. We get our numbers weekly because a lot of the numbers you see are dated once they come out. We're down 40% from a cyclical peak, which sounds like a really scary number, but keep in mind, our numbers were incredibly high for the last couple of years. I mean, housing was just flying. So I think we're seeing some level of normalcy. And clearly, the consumer stretch, mortgage rates spiked up to 6%, now back down to 5%. And that's an issue. I mean, with all inflation and everything else that the consumer is dealing with, people are very concerned about what their pocketbook looks like, what their savings look like, and of course are peeling back on housing, which is not at all a surprise. But as I mentioned before, I just don't see this being anywhere near a GFC type situation because we just don't have the supply we had. We had tremendous supply the last go around, and this time we just don't see it as much. So I think we'll see slow sales for some time. We did see actually a little bit of a spike the last week or so in our housing portfolio, and that's because rates, as I mentioned, peeled down from 6 to 5. So I think some people are taking advantage of it. So I would say the numbers are slow, but not terrible right now.
So Tom, let me go back to that 40% number because it does get your attention, 40% off the cyclical high. But is that a top line number or is that an income number? Because it strikes me that there's a demand issue. People may be more reluctant to buy right now because of the rates. There's also a cost issue because it's more expensive to build, isn't it?
Yeah, that number reflects how many homes we're selling. So that is very much a top line number. I think when the consumer looks to spend, what's happening now we're seeing is people are going for smaller units, not going for as many options, et cetera. But the truth is people still have jobs, right? Our unemployment rate is low. So we're still creating households. We generally create about 1.2 million households a year. So we still need housing units. And what we're seeing is a lot of people are renting over buying, which sort of bodes well for our rental portfolio. So just to throw out a number, like in a lot of our multifamily projects that are, say, 300 units on average, we would see at least 6 people a month leave to move into a house they bought. That number is now just 1 or 2. So what are they doing? They're staying in the rental homes more so than they're going to buy. So I think people are making lifestyle decisions in the unit types that they're going to live in. Are they going to live in an apartment? Are they going to live in a house? And so we're seeing a lot of demand in our single family build to rent portfolio. So and in multifamily. So the rental numbers are actually still staying up. We're not seeing any drop at all in demand in rental housing because what's happening is instead of people actually buying a house, they're renting now because they still have jobs. What happened in the GFC is people lost their jobs, so they moved into the basements of their parents' homes, or they doubled and tripled up. So we instead of having 1.2 million households created, that number dropped in half. And of course, we were producing 2 million homes at that point. So there was this sort of supply and demand shock. We're just not seeing that in the same way today.
Tom, just let me follow up on that in this sense. Do you see that as a longer-term trend? And I asked that question in part because is it substantial enough that you're going to reallocate your capital away from some of the build to sell as opposed to build to rent or multifamily?
I think people do both. Look, keep in mind, your housing is for most families, is the most expensive thing you're ever going to buy. And therefore, the consumers are really smart. And I think they think a lot about it. And look, the millennial generation, of course, and we're now going into their mid to late 30s. They're having families, and theirs is the Uber Airbnb generation. So they don't feel the same concern about having to own as our previous generations do. So I don't know that it's a trend. I think people are just opportunistic. So it's cheaper to rent than buy, so people rent. It's pretty simple. I think if things are then cheaper to buy, they'll go back and start buying more.
Let me try to sneak in one quick one at the end. What about commercial? Does that mean commercial is doing as well or worse, or how's commercial doing?
Commercial is a completely different kettle of fish. I mean, depending on which commercial we're talking about. If we talk about office, B and C class office is really tough right now because, as you know, people are coming back to the office, but certainly work from home is going to be something that's quite permanent. So it's going to be, I think, pretty tough slog, especially for second class office. Interestingly, the Class A office market in a lot of the major cities, with maybe San Francisco being an exception, is actually doing quite well and getting extremely high rents. We really like industrial right now. And the main reason we like industrial is we think that we're seeing a lot of onshoring of manufacturing, which requires more warehouses around those manufacturing facilities. And also, we're seeing these companies can't just have just-in-time delivery of inventory. It just can't be that way anymore. So they need to have more more goods. And so they need more warehouses. So we see a lot of demand for warehouses. We leased over 1 million feet of warehouses in the last month.
Makes a lot of sense. Tom, it's always great to have you. That's
Great.
Tom
Thank
Shapiro.
you so much for having me.
Great to have you. Okay,
Appreciate
from GTIS Partners. Still to come here, we're going to get to talk with former House Majority Leader and MOLAS Vice Chair Eric Cantor. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. We seem to be having a bit of a risk-off day, but Abigail Doolittle is going to explain it all to us. Abigail?
Well, we do have pretty solid declines at this point for the major equity indexes here in the U.S. Not so long ago, all down more than 1%. The worst day for the S&P 500 minutes ago since late June. This, of course, seems to be coming as rates back up. That two-year yield over the last couple of days up more than 15 basis points. The 10-year yield as we speak right now up 11 basis points. And so this is in huge contrast to that CPI report that we had recently that sent stocks rallying. And I think a piece of it, I personally don't usually pay attention to UK inflation, but when it's double digits at 10%, I do. And I think that is certainly pushing on stocks here. The idea that maybe even though that 1 month of lower inflation beating expectations, but let's face it, 8.5 is still high, 10% is not so far away. Are we going to see double-digit inflation? And more so, I think it brings up the idea of the Fed, that they remain hawkish, that there hasn't been a Fed pivot, that there may not be a Fed pivot anytime soon. And so you see some of these big tech stocks selling off. Yeah, it's an interesting theory. I just wonder, I saw that with the UK inflation, and certainly our markets reacted to it. How much of that is thinking, if they got inflation there, we may be having it here too? Is it sort of a contagion, and even a central bank contagion? I think that's exactly what it is. Now, they, of course, have more of an energy crisis than we do here, yes. So you could make the case that maybe we won't see double digit, but it could be a shot across the bow of what's coming here. And yes, absolutely, for central banks, that they have to pay attention to it in terms of the possibility, and that this is not a time to let up the pedal, let up the foot, in terms of hiking, that, maybe it's going to be 75 basis points for a third meeting in a row. We, of course, have to see the inflation data for August in September, but still, these are some signs. But if we weren't anticipating Jay Powell next Friday before, we sure are now. Yes, even more so. Jackson Hole is going to be huge. Yes, and I actually received an IB from Arneem Holzer, who joined us for Options Insight yesterday, talking about conjecture that a lot of people think that the Fed is more likely than not to be much more hawkish last week, that there will be no talk of a Fed pivot. And so when you have that behind-the-scenes talk with traders and strategists, it can leak into the markets, and that is another piece of what's happening today. Yeah, well, Mike McKee and our other colleagues will be out there to cover it. So thank you so much, Abigail Doolittle, for that report on the markets. Coming up, we're going to get to talk with Eric Cantor of MOLAS & Company about what a slowing economy could mean for his business. And we may just ask a question or two also about those midterm primaries that happened yesterday. And that's coming up next on Balance of Power, and we are on Bloomberg Television and on Bloomberg Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. I want to keep you up to date with news from all around the world. And for that, we turn to Mark Crumpton here with the first word. David, thank you. Former Vice President Mike Pence says he would consider testifying before the House committee investigating the January 6, 2021 insurrection at the U.S. Capitol if he is asked to do so. Pence made the remark at a forum in New Hampshire today. The former vice president was at the Capitol on January 6th to preside over the Electoral College vote count as Donald Trump supporters chanted, "Hang Mike Pence," for his refusal to give in to Mr. Trump's demands to overturn the 2020 election. Cuba is seeing its biggest exodus to the United States in decades, following a series of economic setbacks that have worsened shortages and power outages. According to U.S. government data, border officials have encountered nearly 178,000 people fleeing the communist-run Caribbean nation of 11 million so far this fiscal year. That's more than during the Mariel boat lift in 1980 and the Balsero crisis of 1994 combined. Israel and Turkey have agreed to resume full diplomatic ties, including sending ambassadors to the capitals of both countries. The leaders of the two nations spoke by phone today
ending a long period of tensions. Relations between began to thaw earlier this year, spurred on by a visit by Israel's president to Turkey. In Japan, a former top member of the committee that organized the 2020 Tokyo Olympics has been arrested. Prosecutors say Haruyuki Takahashi took bribes totaling nearly $400,000 from executives in exchange for favorable treatment for sponsorship and licensing contracts. The games yielded $8.3 billion from sponsors by the time they kicked off in 2021 after being postponed due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg.
Thank you so much, Mark. Well, we took another step on the road toward the midterm elections this November, yesterday, when we had primaries in Wyoming as well as in Alaska. To bring us up to speed, we turned out to Mario Parker, who heads Bloomberg's political coverage in Washington. Mario, thank you so much for being with us. Let's start in Wyoming. Everybody was fastened on it because of Liz Cheney. How did it turn out for her?
It turned out about as we expected, David. It was an early night out there in Wyoming. Liz Cheney took to her concession speech pretty early in the evening as well, where she essentially said that she had already braced for that moment. She knew that she had defied, or her defiance of former President Donald Trump over the last 17 months or so would have political consequences. And those came home to roost yesterday.
And yet it appears the story's not fully over. First of all, I think she's got a fair amount of money left over from that campaign. And then today she went on NBC's Today Show and said she was at least thinking about maybe running for president next time.
Yeah, just mere hours after that concession speech that we just spoke about, she recalibrated her PAC to be able to raise more money. Now, it's unclear whether or not she's going to run for president, but she did, as you alluded to, she did say that that's something that she's considering earlier on today as well. This is part of this crusade that she's essentially launching. She's cast former President Donald Trump as an existential threat to democracy. And she said even last night that she's going to do anything in her power to stop him from coming back to the White House. Maybe that includes a presidential run. Maybe that includes using those PAC resources to fund opponents, legal fights, et cetera.
So, Mario, let's move farther west out to Alaska, where we had a couple of races, particularly we were all watching. Of course, Sarah Palin as her attempt to get back into politics here. But also we had Lisa Murkowski for Senate. Give us a sense of where those ended up.
Yeah, well, Sarah Palin, essentially the proto-Trump, right? She's former President Donald Trump's political predecessor in a way. And then you've got Lisa Murkowski, as you mentioned, who also, similar to Liz Cheney, voted to impeach the president for his role in the January 6, 2021 insurrection. Lisa Murkowski, the way that they handle the elections out there in Alaska, ranked choice voting, it's very unique, but that allowed her to essentially survive her primary contest against Kelly Tshibaka, who Trump is endorsing in ways that Liz Cheney was unable to do.
Yeah, it's unique, except we have it increasingly in other places, including now we have it in New York City, this ranked choice voting. Take us through that, because my understanding is that might give Lisa Murkowski a bit of an edge, because it's thought historically ranked choice voting helps the moderates, the center, more than the wings.
You're absolutely right. In primaries, it's very crucial for folks like Lisa Murkowski, right? Because it helps them to make it out of those primaries into general elections, where they could get tailwinds from both Democratic voters and independent voters in a way that in other states, for example, in Wyoming yesterday, that was predominantly GOP Republican primary voters, even though Liz Cheney did make a pitch to get some of the Democrats to switch over. There just weren't enough to save her political career as in the U.S. House. But Murkowski, for example, the ranked choice voting helps her to pivot to the November election, where she has strong chances against Kelly Tshibaka.
Okay, Mario, thank you so much for that reporting. That's Mario Parker. He leads Bloomberg's political coverage down in Washington. Coming up, former Speaker of the House Eric Cantor on the future of the Republican Party and also how Moelis & Company is doing in the midst of a downturn. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. What we want to do here on Balance of Power is cover business as well as politics. And when it comes to that combination, there is nobody as good as Eric Cantor. He's vice chair of Moelis & Company, and he also earlier served as majority leader of the House of Representatives. Welcome. It's great to have you here in New York, Eric.
David, it's great to be here.
Okay, give me a minute or two on politics, just because we had the Cheney primary, we had the Alaska primary yesterday. Give us a sense overall with where you think the midterms are headed at this point, if we can tell.
Well, listen, I mean, it's still, I would say, early. I think people and voters don't really start to pay attention to elections until after Labor Day. But all signs indicate really good prospects for my party, the Republicans, to regain a majority in the House of Representatives. And I do think that there are great prospects for their Republicans to overtake and become the majority in the Senate as well.
Do you think that this legislation takes anything out of those prospects? I'm talking about the CHIPS Act and also the Inflation Reduction Act, as they call it.
Well, I think the Democratic Party have been, certainly trying to impart that view onto the electorate to say, hey, we can get something done. But, you have to believe that, in the end, Joe Manchin was going to come around and be with his party to allow for some legislative victory. But I think even the other question that's out there is whether the Supreme Court decision in the Dobbs case is going to overwhelm what I think, though, is the most important issue this election, which is inflation. And I don't think it will.
Yeah, fascinating. One last one on this. Liz Cheney, obviously, she lost badly in her primary. And then she came on Today's show this morning on NBC and said she might think about running for president. This is part of what she had to say.
I will be doing whatever it takes to keep Donald Trump out of the Oval Office.
Well, I know you didn't say yes or no, and that's fine if you're thinking about it, but are you thinking about it? Are you thinking about running for president?
That's a decision that I'm going to make in the coming months, Savannah. I'm not going to make any announcements here this morning, but it is something that I'm thinking about, and I'll make a decision in the coming months.
So is your party one party at this point, Eric, or is there a possibility of sort of a division between the Trump and the non-Trump?
We're one party, and I always say after the results last night in Wyoming, indicative of the fact that you just can't underestimate Donald Trump. I saw a stat today, David, that I believe he has endorsed something like 220 some people. And I think there maybe has a 5% loss rate, which means there's a 95% success rate of people who actually are going to be back in office. So you just can't underestimate him. He is the outsized force and impact in our party right now.
Yeah, no question about it. Okay, let's turn to the other side of your portfolio and your expertise, and that's the business side. Tell us about Moelis & Company. There's a bit of a slowing, certainly in parts of the economy right now we're seeing. How is that affecting your business?
Well, as you know, Moelis & Company, we primarily are an M&A firm, and so we are always watching the deal environment. And there's no question that the macro environment continues to be challenging, which has really resulted in the elongation of completion timelines for deals. And along with that, what we've seen is even you've got to have one of the most pristine transactions for financing to be easily obtained. So, what we're seeing out there right now with a lot of the macro headwinds, it's just there's certainly much more challenging macro forces. But at the same time, our bankers at Moelis & Company are still very engaged with our clients. The clients are displaying an appetite to transact. Because there's a lot of cash sitting on the sidelines. I just think right now we've got to see the financing market come back into equilibrium.
Are you seeing a little bit of a counterforce in terms of valuations coming down? Things are cheaper, and therefore people might be willing to make more deals. Things they couldn't afford before, maybe they can afford now.
We are seeing signs where sellers are beginning to accept and willing to accept current market valuations and transact with buyers who are willing to transact at those levels. We absolutely are. And I think, again, once the buyers are able to obtain financing, we should see a lot more deal activity and a surge in that activity come about.
Looking below sort of the top line of it, are there particular areas that are hot? I know back in June you were saying energy was something you're seeing a lot of interest in right now.
Well, I certainly think the energy sector writ large, whether it's the conventional energy sector, oil and gas, or whether some of the renewable sectors are very much in focus on the part of investors. Molson Company has a big presence in the Middle East, and our office is very busy there with a lot of dialogue going about how to allocate capital. And obviously, the countries there in Saudi Arabia and UAE in particular, very focused on diversifying their economy and attracting investment to do so, and they've been very successful at that. I think here at home, I mean, what we're seeing is areas that have attracted a lot of focus. Obviously, infrastructure on the heels of the passage of an Infrastructure Act, where I think people are getting ready to sort of try and read between the lines in Washington once all that money is unleashed, and investors are lining up for that with a big need in our country. But we're also seeing at Moelis, a lot of demand on the part of business services, and that's a broad category, but always one that's very strong. Healthcare services as well. And I believe ultimately, we are just in this age of technology and disruption, and that is one of the big forces of M&A, both from a strategic standpoint as well as our sponsor clients.
You're the first to know that there are forces at play in the economy bigger than Washington, but Washington is a force nonetheless. And when you look at the Infrastructure Reduction Act, as it's called, and its possible effect on energy, renewables as well as fossil fuels, and also for that matter, the CHIPS and Science. Do you think that those acts in and of themselves may generate more activity in energy, in tech?
Well, you have got an extraordinary amount of capital that will be allocated by Washington. And let me just say preemptively, I never have thought that's a good idea to put Congress in the seat or the administration in the seat of allocating capital. But essentially, that's what's happened here. There is, for the first time, both in the CHIPS and Science Act as well as the Inflation Reduction Act, industrial policy that's coming through. And, it was in response to a lot of the reaction from the pandemic and from the situation around China, Taiwan, et cetera, that perhaps we ought to take a closer look at being able to ensure that we have critical supply chains based here, whether it's in rare earth minerals or whether it's in the semiconductor space. And much of those monies are going to be tied to the fact that manufacturing, if they're going to receive the benefit, will have to be located here. So I do think there'll be activity, and it'll push, sort of capital in the private sector that direction as well.
So finally, if you were to give one piece of advice, I mean, whether you think they were good ideas or bad ideas, they're done now. If you're going to one piece of advice on the issue you addressed, I mean, for example, on the CHIPS Act, $52 billion being invested by the U.S. government in various ways or supported by the U.S. government. It can be misspent. There can be waste. There can be even fraud. We've seen that in the past. What would your piece of advice be to say this is how to do it smarter?
Well, they have to tie it to actual productivity. And I know when I was in the State House in Virginia, we tried to compete, and I did fairly well against other states in attracting investment. And the design of the benefit programs that we had then for that kind of investment was tied to actual productivity and results. And that means job creation, that means tax revenues. Once they occur, then the benefits should flow. So I do think that would be a better design. One of the things, David, that we have as a challenge right now is the labor force in our country and the skilled labor required for a semiconductor industry. And I do think that there is a lot for Washington to do to help encourage that development of a skilled workforce so that we will actually have workers to be in these plants that are now going to be funded by the federal largesse.
That's a really important point, Eric. Thank you so much, and thanks for being here. Really good to have you here. That's Eric Cantor. He's Moelis Vice Chairman and Managing Director. We have some breaking news right now on Apple from Bloomberg's Mark Gurman. The tech giant is aiming to hold a launch event on September 7th to unveil the iPhone 14, which makes sense because I just bought a new 13 over the weekend. New products are expected to reach stores later that month. The iPhone generates more than half of Apple's sales. Coming up, we continue our City Hall series looking at the issues facing the nation's cities with the mayor of San Antonio, Ron Nierenberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. We on Balance of Power are looking at the issues facing our nation's cities in a series called City Hall. And today we welcome Mayor Ron Nirenberg of San Antonio, the 7th largest city in the country. So, Mr. Mayor, thank you so much for joining us. I just told you I hadn't realized it was the 7th largest city. I should have been paying attention. But congratulations, that's a pretty big city. Give us a sense of what the issues are that are of importance to you and your citizens of San Antonio right now.
Sure. Here in San Antonio, we are enjoying, some back to normal school activities. Of course, where we are with the long tail of the COVID pandemic, nothing is normal at this point, but we are starting to come back. The economy is rebounding nicely. Schools are back in session, and we're really focused on how we can make sure that we're more resilient in the future. Specifically, we are also dealing with the massive crime that's going on across the country. Mayors are engaged across the country this week in a week of action to call attention to and call to action prevention of gun violence, which has been an enormous problem throughout our country in rural communities as well after this pandemic.
Well, and you're not far, as I understand it, from Uvalde, which is clearly one of the most horrific incidents we've had, certainly in recent history. But what can mayors do, I guess, with their police departments, with others, to really curb some of the violence? By the way, we've got it in New York City, goodness knows.
That's right. Well, so mayors are on the front lines, and frankly, we value the lives of our community more than we value the weapons that are killing the folks in our community. And so we have called on our leaders at the state level, where we are facing a lot of pushback and frankly weakening of gun laws, to really reform what we have going on here. In Texas, frankly, is a governor and a legislature who, rather than trying to make the issues, trying to resolve the issues, have actually weakened our gun laws over the last several years. I'm the chair of the Big City Mayors Coalition of Texas, and recently we've come together in a bipartisan way to call on Governor Abbott to issue a special session, as well as pass the red flag law that has been enabled now and incentivized by the federal legislation. We're also working to ensure that there is proper universal background checks, that we properly fund our school safety officers, mental health funding as well. But we need a collective effort, and it really requires some assistance from the federal and state government, and that's what we're calling on them to do.
Another issue that I know is of importance in San Antonio, but also its importance in New York City again right now, and that's immigration, particularly some of the people coming across without permission across the border. Give us your sense of what the situation is in San Antonio, and because you have experience with it, what do you think we should be doing? Where should we be heading?
You know, we have migration challenges at all times of the year, and we know that there's an incredible challenge of migration that's happening throughout the southern border. What we in San Antonio experience is, people coming from Central and South America, largely looking to create a better life. We help with the processing of getting folks to their sponsor families, and a lot of them arriving needing some shelter, some assistance to get to their next destination. These are asylum seekers, and so we work with our local nonprofits, our faith community, and our city government to make sure that we have accommodations for that. And the migration flows increase and ebb and flow throughout the year. As a result of the speculation of the ending of Title 42, there's been an increase in flow. So we're working to accommodate that in cooperation with the federal government. We opened a migrant resource center to help consolidate some of that activity, and so we can treat the issues, the humanitarian issues, in a compassionate manner, and ultimately help, again, process the folks who are here trying to reach their ultimate destination.
And Mr. Mayor, finally, something we talk about on Bloomberg all the time is inflation and the way it's affecting people right across the country. How is it affecting people in San Antonio and your government?
It is a challenge, and the increased costs of energy and fuel have impacted virtually every part of our life. And in San Antonio, obviously, that includes labor costs. And so we have a number of different things that we're trying to do in terms of housing assistance, helping people with your utility bills, ensuring that folks who need assistance with food security also have that kind of programming available. So it is impacting nearly every aspect of life. And so we have used our local dollars coupled and leveraged with federal assistance to help with folks' needs throughout this challenging period.
Mr. Mayor, thank you so very much for being with us. Really helpful. That's Ron Nierenberg. He's the mayor of San Antonio. Check out the Balance of Power newsletter on the terminal and online. Coming up, we're going to continue Balance of Power for the next hour on Bloomberg Radio. Please join us there. And this is Bloomberg.